Great. Thank you guys very much for joining us. We're doing another webinar today on automating receipts. And so we'll be talking about a couple different formats for it. One of the interesting things about, or the things that we have to keep in mind with the receipting process is that this does require that you have, of course, your gifts in someplace where we can access this information. The primary tool that we're going to use to send out the receipts is going to be Relay. We're going to talk about a couple different ways in which that actually works. I'll also be talking, in my language, I'll be talking about receipts. Really keep in mind that it's really terminology. So even though there is a difference between sending out a receipt and sending out an acknowledgement after somebody gives us a gift, it's really more about the language that we produce or put onto the receipt than the function itself. So the process that we're going to talk about would work for either receipts or acknowledgements, or in fact, if you wanted to send receipts and acknowledgements, this process that we're going to talk about today would work for either one of those. So with the Agilon 1 product, there's really two different types of configurations that we'll be introducing, talking a little bit about today. We've got clients that have done both of them. The two that we're going to talk about, you'll actually be able to see. The first one is an inline receipt. And the inline receipt is configured just a little bit differently. It relies more on the HTML and the query to deliver information directly into an email, so that when somebody gets the email receipt, they're going to see all of the individual rows of giving that they have. So they'll see a gift on a certain day from a certain fund for a certain amount, and they'll see underneath that one the other gift that they gave, if there's multiple gifts or multiple designations. So they'll actually see the receipt as part of the email. The second version that we're going to be looking at briefly is called a linked version. And in this version, it's a little more secure than actually sending the receipt information directly in the email. This provides, so it still sends out an email based on a certain frequency to a donor, and you can put your letter in there, whatever you want to spell out for them. But instead of having the detail of the receipt right in the email, there will be a link in the email that they will click, and that will take them into Constituent Connection, where they will log in using their Constituent Connection login credentials. And at that point, then they'll be taken to the My Giving page, where they can print the receipt that they are being alerted about, or in that matter, they could be printing any receipt from historically that they have, or produce a summary receipt. So a little bit different method to go about those. So the first example is an inline receipt, and what you see on the page is exactly what they're going to be getting in the receipt. So it'll be addressed to the person, to the donor. There'll be a letter that you can control, and then in the distribution area, that will actually show the individual gifts that this person gave. In this case, this person, Karen, gave to the same fund, one gift for $250 and one gift for $100 in the same day. Probably not very realistic, because they would have been combined, but this does show that the data is actually delivered right in the email. The second version is this linked receipt. This is an example that ECU had used last year. I think they had stopped using this version, but it's a little different. So instead of actually sending the receipt directly in the email, they sent a kind of a shell letter that said, thank you, in this case the person's name is Maverick, thank you for your donation, and click on this button to receive your print or view your receipt. Once they click on that, they are taken to where they can log in using their user ID and password. If we knew that they hadn't already logged in and created a user ID and password, then it would have stepped them through their process to create a constituent connection user ID and password. So a little different animal. That would take them to the My Giving page where they can click on the Show Receipt button and print out the receipt at that point. So this version utilizes the Crystal report to deliver the receipt, and that might be what you're using already for producing your letter receipts. So you get a little bit of synergy by using the same exact Crystal report to deliver both your letter and your email receipt. So regardless of which of those two methods you decide that you may want to use, again, both of them are using selection wizard queries. Both of them are using relay jobs to send the receipts or the message out to the donor after they've given a gift. And they both will potentially use daily schedules to produce letters for new donors and reprint requests. So basically you have two processes running at the same time. One that's going to produce receipts for people with email addresses and meet certain criteria, and another process that's going to run to send them letters. So one of the things that we need to make sure we're taking into consideration when we're building any process for sending out email receipts is we need to make sure that those two processes, the letter process and the email process, are working together. We might really want to send email receipts out to all of our donors, but a lot of institutions do not have email addresses for everybody. So having those two processes running in tandem is really important. So we're going to look at a couple of the questions that you'll need to think about before you can decide if you're going to do an email process. We need to think about the data requirements, the default behavior, user preferences for deciding, letting a donor decide which of those two options they'd like, and then providing an option for reprints. There's always a little bit of flexibility when it comes to setting these up as to where the information might be stored, how you might identify whether or not somebody has, in this case, an active email address. I've included in the demonstration an example of what we might put into a selection wizard query that would either include somebody to being available for the email receipt. In this case, they have an active email address in the address system, or we would use that as a not exists in the letter option. So we would want to only allow people that don't have the email addresses, or that would preclude them from getting the email address, or the email letter, which means they have to get the printed letter. You might have other rules out there about whether or not you want to send emails to both individuals or organizations. I know I have at least one client who does not send any email receipts out to their organizations. They want those all to be printed. You might have certain individuals who you need to customize each of those letters, and so you might want to have those go to a printed receipt so that they can be manually modified. So trying to think about who's going to be getting the email, who's going to be getting the printed letter. We'd also want to think about things like how do we want to handle living versus deceased donors, which sounds like a really odd thing to say, but it could be a timing thing, although fairly unlikely that somebody would give a donation and then a day later when we print the receipt out, they would have died, but they're marked in the system. More likely is you actually accept donations on a deceased constituent's record, tagging it against that constituent. What do we want to do in that situation? Should we still send out an email? Do we need to use a contact person's name or the next of kin name in the process? So just thinking about that specific situation, how do we want to handle deceased people? We'll definitely change which address we might want to pull for a deceased donor. So user preferences is also a very big piece of sending out these receipts. We need to maintain an option for your donors to decide how to receive their receipts, either by printed and mailed receipt, or by email, or by no receipt. And giving them that option means that we can control then those two processes by following their wishes. Their ability to set those preferences can be, I'm going to give you two different options. One option would be to use attributes, which are new terminology in 4.5. Those are our user groups. So setting up a user group or an attribute to collect whether or not somebody wants email receipts or a printed receipt or no receipt at all. Or we could set up a user variable to track that information. One of the nice things about using an attribute or a user group is that that's something that we can then pass along to our donors and let them continue to make changes to their preference by using a web form. I'll show you an example of that. So this was an example of a web form. I can't even remember who I set this up for, but basically it uses a user group or an attribute in one. We turn on a web form for our donors, and you can pass this URL to the donors, maybe in another relay campaign. This could be something that is maybe added to the receipt that gets sent out from one, or it could be an independent action where we're just doing some due diligence with our donors, our past donors, sending out an email to say, hey, we're just started sending out email receipts, and we'd like you to let us know which option you prefer. So that's kind of what this one is set up to do. How do you want us to, or how do you want to receive your gift receipts? And being able to start to manage that information. So in this case, the donor or a constituent would get this email, and they would click on a link that would take them to a page that might look like this. And once they set their preference, don't send me a gift receipt, or send me a gift receipt by U.S. mail, or send me my receipt by email. As soon as they put that information in and click the Save button, that information gets immediately written onto their constituent record. Now, this is just an example of the attribute. Mine is called Receipt Preferences Daily. And one of the nice things about setting up an attribute or a user group is that historically it gives you a really easy way to see if your donors are out making changes to their own receipt preferences. In this case, in 2015, on October 21st, the preference for this person was set to send each gift receipt by U.S. mail, and that was a preference that was set by this user through Constituent Connection. But on October 28th, the administrator made a change to that user's preference and set it to no receipt preference. So it gives us a very visible view of what's happening. The donor themselves, they can hold on to that URL as a favorite in their browser, and they can really go and set this preference, change this preference whenever they would like to. So it takes us out as a middleman on controlling what their preference is. Sometimes that control is easy to let go, and sometimes it makes us a little more uncomfortable. But an attribute or a user group plus a web form is one easy way for us to increase visibility into receipt preferences. The second option, and probably one that you're more familiar with, is just setting up a user variable to track what their preferences are. I think it's important to consider having a separate set of preferences for receipts versus other kinds of communication preferences, just to keep it clean, to make sure that they have a very easy option for setting what the receipt preferences are, since that is since we're going to have processes tied to that. You'd also want to make sure that you don't track both preferences as an attribute and as user variable. You're going to do one or the other, so we can make sure that our queries are attuned to the proper set of data for attributes or user variables. It's certainly something that we can change if you decide you would like to do attributes and you have been doing user variables, but it is something you'll want to make sure you're deciding. We also need to look at default behavior. So if somebody does not have a preference, which is going to be most of our donors will not have actually given us a preference, we'll need to make a decision, an institutional decision, as to whether or not we should send somebody an email or not, even if they don't have a preference. And I think most of our clients are making the decision that if somebody has an active email address, we will by default send out an email receipt unless we hear back from the donor that says they do not want that. That kind of gives us the most bang for the buck, and I think that's been working out fairly well for people. Now, of course, if somebody does not have an active email, we have to send them a letter. So this is a pretty good process for default behavior. The last setup item that we would be concerned about is how are we going to allow someone internally to reprint these kinds of receipts that are automated. And if there's certainly many ways to make this happen. It could be a whole manual process where you have you have a report and you can copy the receipt and put it into an email and send it out. But I've really found that it's easiest to simply integrate the reprints into the processes that are already running. So we have this relay job that runs every day and sends out the receipts via email. We have another job that's running every day and producing the printed letters. What we want to do is allow there to be an input mechanism for your internal users to flag a specific gift to be included in that process, even though the gift is maybe old, or the receipt was printed and sent out to this donor a few weeks ago, and they called up and said, "Hey, no, can I just get it in an email?" You can make those preferences changes and then include this gift in the reprint process and let it go out through email, or the other way around. No, we never read that email address anymore. Can you please just print our receipt? Make sure you change the preferences on the donor to sending a letter, and then include that gift in the reprint process, and it would just get picked up in those daily receipts that are going to be printed. So what generally I recommend people do is to set up a date user variable field on the gift and label it something like reprint date. And for any gift that has a reprint date that's the same as today, or the date that your process is running, that gift would get included then in either the email process or the letter process. So it works really cool. You don't have to do anything special. It just gets picked up in that daily process, and there's no extra work that you need to work with. So then we have the relay campaign. So the relay campaign is what is going to be sending out our email receipt. So when we do an inline email receipt, we have the HTML that's built within the relay campaign set up to send around 10 designations. So that's what my default format is. That can be changed. I think I have one client with 10 designations. I have another with 15 designations. What that means is 10 individual gifts that can be sent out on a day. Within that relay campaign, there's the header image and logo. There's the footer image and logo. We have the letter text that you'll be changing. I'll kind of show you what the relay campaign looks like a little bit. And then there's the detail gift designation. This is an example of what the output might look like. And I've gotten rid of a lot of the columns that are there. But what the columns might look like when we have a inline email receipt. One of the neat things about this is we've really just flattened out all of the data. And so for every donor that's included, each row, if you're used to working with Relay, every row in a Relay selection, in the selection wizard query we use for Relay, really delivers an email. And so we have to flatten out the data. We have one row, this is for Karen. And in this row, after we get done identifying who she is, what's her name and her address, what's her email address, we get into the gift detail. And this is all one big row for Karen. And this is an example of someone who has two gifts. So we have this first gift for $250 to fund one. And here's our fund title. And eventually we get over here to column AV, and this is the second set of information for the gifts for Karen. And we identify how much the second gift is, and the third gift, and the fourth gift, and the fifth gift. And this is why we have a specific limit on how many gifts there are. And we have to take that in consideration when we're looking at gifts as well, to make sure that we don't leave some gifts off. So in this example where we have 10 designations, we need to make sure that that if there's 11 designations, that this person is pushed over into a printed letter instead of the email process. The linked option, instead of the inline version, uses a different type of query. We don't need to flatten out the data like this, because the Crystal report will group things for us and put everything together into a single letter. So again, this is what the receipt might look like. And this is whether or not this is the inline version or the linked version. Once they finally look at their receipt, there really doesn't have to be a difference in the way that it looks. The Relay Receipt Campaign, or the email receipt, it's typically scheduled to run every day. And it's going to be looking for any new gifts sent to the ledger. So we're using the donor activity approval date DB. At least that's what I recommend that we use. And it can be set up to run, depending upon when it gets set up to run, the campaign would determine how we decide which date to pull in. So if we are going to be processing the campaign after midnight, so let's say at 1 o'clock in the morning, then we want to run that and run the query so that it looks at any gifts that were processed the day before, yesterday. If we're processing this campaign at 8 o'clock in the evening, then we want to process it looking at the gifts that were processed today. So that just changes, depends on when you're going to process that as to how we actually write the query itself. Once we get into the relay campaign and we're building the HTML or the image, what's going to be sent out in the email, you can see in this example we're using the HTML editor. We've brought in our image for the top of the relay campaign. We're bringing in merge fields, and then we have text for the letter. And this is something that we may want to make periodic changes to the body of the receipt. We have, in fact, Ozark Christian College, they are creating a new copy of their receipt campaign every month because they want to produce fresh content for those donors that give multiple times. So they're changing their email campaign. And then they have a copy of what it looks like, what it looked like in January, what did it look like in February. And they're simply just making new versions or new copies of those campaigns and processing the same process through, but building out and stopping the old campaigns. With the inline receipt, there's a lot of work done in the HTML. So instead of which we'll see instead of just putting a button in there that says, hey, click this button to go into constituent connection where you can see your receipt, we have to build the data or take the data from the query and use merge fields and conditional content to put it in line directly into the HTML. So this portion of the HTML, which is the conditional logic that says for the first gift, look for that first gift, and if one exists, put it in this position. If there's a second gift, put it in the second position, third gift, fourth gift, so on and so forth. Once that's set up and you've defined how you want to show the date and the fund, the title, and the amount, that information doesn't need to get changed anymore. So you might change the content of the letter, the letter text, but as for the other logic that's built in, that's something you don't really need to change. So that can stay static, even if you're making new copies every month and changing the content and adding new images. This logical piece, the conditional content, doesn't need to get changed. In fact, I would recommend that it doesn't. Keep it as simple as possible. When we're doing that linked receipt campaign, like ECU used, they still had a relay campaign that was running, and they still had text at the top of the letter that said, hey, thank you for your gift, and there was some merge content, and there's some logic that was built in. So you might change some of the letter features of this or the letter text. But this conditional content that says, hey, use this part of the text should be for people who have never registered for CCON before. Use this part of the text when people have not read or have already registered, they have a user ID and password. You wouldn't change that conditional content. You would leave that logic alone and just change the kind of text around it. So once you have your relay campaign set up and you've got your queries that are kicking off every night to provide the data that's going to be sent out in these emails, your relay campaign can really run indefinitely, other than maybe wanting to adjust the text every once in a while. You really wouldn't have to. Some clients adjust their receipts annually, but if you're using merge fields, you can include the year of the receipt. You could include different merge content that, of course, identifies the designations of those gifts. But text could be modified, and you could create new versions every year, new copied versions. It's really up to you at that point. Again, I mentioned the one client that uses that creates a new version every month to produce some really cool dynamic content that's different every month. And don't forget about the relay content that can be, the regular functions that are part of relay. So if you wanted to include additional links within the receipt that maybe would drive people to look at other things, or if you wanted to include conditional links based on the funds that they gave to, where they can click on a link and it drives them to maybe the fund description or what a specific college has been doing with the money that people are giving. You can use that click-through tracking that's built into Relay to find out who is driving through which links you've included in the Relay campaign. You're still going to be able to see your bounces. So which email addresses are getting bounce responses, which ones are getting out of office alerts, so you can start to control some of those email addresses and make sure that you are getting these receipts to people. Using the function within Relay for the opt-outs because you know that even though you might tell Relay to send an email to an email address, if that person has chosen an opt-out option from a previous Relay campaign, it's possible that if you're using the same organization or whichever opt-out they've signed up for, that we won't send the receipt out to them. And so they'll show up on this opt-out list as someone who has opted out of this particular kind of Relay campaign. So we may want to use that information and set their preference within the preferences section that we have set up. So we send them an email or a letter version right away. The other thing that I wanted to show is new in 4.5, which is also going to be useful. We really haven't had a great tool that shows you when a receipt has been sent out. It's, of course, understood that if somebody gives us a gift that we're sending them a receipt. But by sending that receipt out through Relay, we have a record of the fact that we've sent that out through the Relay campaign. And in this new timeline page in 1, we can see every time somebody has been sent something through Relay. And that is part of that communications section there. And in this screenshot, you can see that there's just one yellow line there in mid-June of 2018 for this constituent. And if you were to hover over that yellow bar, it would have told you which Relay campaign this person was included in. In this case, it would have been a receipt campaign that was sent out. So we could see that they received an email receipt. And typically that would probably go in line with a donation line. So we would see both a donation, a red donation line, and a communication line very close to one another if we sent them out a Relay receipt. So some pretty cool things that are just regular parts of Relay campaigns, but by combining that with a selection wizard query that can automatically pull data and feeding that into our Relay campaigns, we can still customize those receipts by using conditional content and by using merge fields, but it can leads us into a more hands-off approach for those standard kinds of receipts and allows us to focus our time then on those ones that are non-standard. So setup itself, there's a lot of moving pieces, so we definitely help with setting that up. Includes creating new output templates to be linked to the selection wizard queries that we're going to be using. We'll be building HTML for those email receipts, building crystal reports for the printed receipts, or you might already have those. So deciding which of those options you're going to use, the linked version or the inline version of the email receipts. And then you can also decide to do multiple versions of those receipts. We're just finishing up a project for a client where they already send out their daily receipts and changing those over to being acknowledgement letters, terminology. And they're going to be sending out their year-end receipts once a year that provides one email that has all the summarized donations for them for the year. So taking a variation of what we just looked at and using that for their year-end receipt as well. So at the end of the year, they'll simply copy their last year's campaign, change text, kick off the job, and they'll be producing both a letter and an email version of their year-end summary receipt. So I went pretty quickly through that. At least I feel like I did, since my throat's getting a little dry. But now is the time. Does anybody have any questions about how this might be set up, or questions about what I have provided in this presentation?
Bob, this is Brad from ISU.
Yeah, Brad.
We are getting this going, starting to think about this process. And one of the things we come up with is, say, Google, wherever it places an email, if it goes to promotions, it goes to wherever, that, there are limits to what we can control, or how it lands in front of who we're trying to send it to. Is there any thoughts, have you guys have thought to that, or how we best make sure it lands in front of people?
Just meaning as you deliver the email to their email box, yeah, whether or not if it shows up in their inbox or goes to their spam folder?
Right. It's not a hard bounce, it's not a hard bounce against delivered, but the email receiver, we don't know that's lying right in front of them. Yeah. Any tips on how to make sure it lands in their inbox?
So this has been an ongoing challenge, and OCC can attest to this. Each of our clients sets up their email servers. They're all just a little bit different. So through some trial and error, we finally we made some better. We now have some better recommendations for how to set things up and making sure that the DKIM records are all set up properly. And I don't think Tony's on because I'll get my language all twisted around. But there are some specific measures we can make sure that you have in place for your setup for the mail server that it's being sent out of to help with that, to make sure that it is getting presented properly, that Gmail or Google and some of the other servers will recognize, and we've done everything on our part to make sure that it doesn't appear like spam that's being sent out. There's still going to be some challenges with that as email filters get stronger, but we do have some recommendations for those, and we would certainly be sharing those with you when we're setting these things up, and maybe have some recommendations, especially even for other normal relay campaigns. It's really the same animal, to make sure that everything is set up and you're not getting your email sent to the wrong place.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you, Brad. That was a good one. Any other questions? Let's see. Here we go. There's a question that came up that said, could you talk a little bit about why you had a print date set up in the gift and didn't follow why that was happening? Sure. And yeah, so the big reason for that is so our normal process is running every day. And let's say that somebody calls us up and says, hey, I gave you a gift last week and I didn't receive my receipt. Okay, well, there's several things that we can do. We'll, of course, look to see, do we have the gift? Did we send, what is their preference set to? Is their preference set to get a letter? Is their preference set to get an email? Can we kind of troubleshoot why they may not have received the receipt? So that's, of course, one of the things that we need to do. Well, the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter why they didn't get one. We still need to send them a new receipt out. So one of the easiest ways to do that is to use this reprint date that's set up on the gift. So I've used a gift user variable date field, and I've labeled it as reprint receipt. And if I were to take that call today from Joni, and Joni says, I need you to send me the receipt again, all I need to do is go to Joni's gift page, gift record, and go to that reprint receipt field, set it to today's date. And because that date is now set to today's date, that gift is going to be included in the receipts that are going to get processed tonight. So my receipt process looks at gifts that are processed on the day, as well as any gifts that we've flagged to say, hey, reprint this gift today. So it allows us to put a gift that's already been included in the receipt process, and allows us to insert it back into the daily receipt process, so we don't have to do anything other than just say, include this receipt. Did that help at all, Mark? Another question was how long on average does it take to make a receipt in Crystal Reports? That can be kind of a trick question. I already have some base receipts that I'm happy to share with you. With a base receipt, adding and a selection was a query that would go with it. When I create a new one on a new instance, as long as I'm not, my rules are pretty much the same. If you have a lot of exclusion, a lot of conditional content, all of those add complexity. But a basic gift receipt where we have gifts that are not gift in kind or gifts of stock, that we're going to produce the gift date, gift amount, gift designation, and then we have a different rule for gift in kind. 4-5 hours to get your selection wizard queries and everything set up for a Crystal report. If you're going to be conditionally making a lot of changes to the receipt, 8 hours, 10 hours, it can just kind of expand from there. I think most of the time when I quote out, if I was to do it for you, it's because of the back and forth. I would quote out, about 8 hours or so to create the crystal report, especially if you have the selection was a query written already. Another question is, could we set up the reprint process and put it into the hands of the donor with a web page? A very good question. I would need to think about that. So I suppose the tricky, if you have somebody log into CCon, then they have the ability to reprint any receipt that they want. So we'll say that first. As far as a relay campaign, like an inline receipt where we'd let them reprint. If we added the some kind of a web link for them to say, hey, send me my last receipt, something that was just that simply, reprint my last receipt for me, that's something that could be put into a web form potentially, where if they said that, we would, as soon as they said yes on that web form, print my last receipt, we could use that very similar to that date that's on the gift record and say, if there is a yes value and the date is today, go ahead and print their last receipt. It would be more difficult if we wanted them to do to tell us which of their receipts they wanted to reprint, just because we don't really make that information public. But I think that with a little bit of thought, we could probably come up with a way to make something like that happen. Like I said, if it was just print my last receipt again, then yes, that is something that could be just added into the normal daily process that was running. Good questions. Okay. Well, thank you guys very much for joining in the session today. If you've attended and I've flagged your account in event registration as attended, you will be getting, I believe, in about 45 minutes, another email, which is the it's a webinar survey. It's 5 questions. It's really easy to do, but it does help us to understand whether or not there's some things that we could do better to help you guys through the webinar. I appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. And if you need access to the recording, please, you can call into support. You can call myself directly again. This is Bob Wolf, and we'll make the recording available to you as soon as it's done compiling. Thanks a lot. Bye. Bye-bye, guys.